and then also with the youth that we work with, this is a way to bring them into the, future jobs, future trainings
Yeah.
for the community as well, for them to get opportunities to, whether it's maintenance, whether it's setup, for employment, things like that. So yeah, and then for, obviously for your project, pilot case, usage data, different sort of climate
Yeah. I mean,
conditions.
personally, I think it's exactly, I mean, it's encouraging that you would already see the opportunity here, right, for something that is essentially, a problem in Europe that needs to be dealt with, can have application in another
Yeah,
context that is like very, very valuable. And I think that's the sort of core value proposition here. And it's almost in a way nice to have that validated in
absolutely.
this context.
Yeah.
But I wonder,
No, I wanted to just sort of add, I'm Ashwin Dayal from Rockefeller Foundation. And so while we're supporting the project, I'm kind of going to behave like an audience member here because I have some ideas and I'm not that involved with it. And I wish our colleague Ali Al Safar was with us today. But I think it's really interesting that you've raised this question because I think for this to work, as you do the technical studies and as you deal with some of the questions like certification and quality assurance and all of that, you're also going to need partners who are inspired by this, who are interested in testing this and seeing can it be a solution in the context that I'm working with. The question I was going to ask before you intervened was around sort of something around who are the users going to be. And it seems to me, and maybe this is a question for David and for Eric, there seems to me there are like two categories of users. There's the sort of non-profit slash UN type world that has really tight budgets and but can gain need sort of publicly funded energy supply. And then there's the kind of for-profit mini grid developer world that's still trying to squeeze out a bit more cost saving because these business models are so tight still, right? Mini grid developers are really struggling. So I'd love to see how we can kind of think about the two markets. I've been having a lot of discussions with different UN agencies who are all talking about doing more on distributed renewables. How do we support refugee communities? How do we look at multiple different settings? And they do massive procurement. I mean, they're spending billions of dollars every year on diesel. So, right. So how do we build I know we're still testing the solution, I get it. So we're not there yet. But I think if we could engage the users, like organizations like yours, NGOs, UN organizations, mini grid developers, bring them in early into this project, then they might have feedback that'll help you to sort of refine it. So it's sort of a comment and a question. I'm curious for your thoughts on how do we start to build an ecosystem of potential users and implementers?
I'll take the first crack. Thank you. So, our work with UN peacekeeping and humanitarian organizations is specifically addressing what you just said. The idea is to think of them as anchor clients for the private sector renewable energy developers to be able to develop more bankable projects, improve the economics of projects in difficult places where you have these missions, internationally supported, funded missions with budgets in dollars with large energy footprints. So I think there's a way to do that that's still emerging in that system. I mean, it's early days. There are a few pilots of public-private sector PPAs between UN agencies and private sector developers. I would think for this idea to be plausible, universal access would have to be built in. And so like if we're thinking about a refugee camp, for example, it doesn't make sense to do this only to provide power, clean power to those that have the budgets for it. We would have to build in to the core concept, universal access for refugee populations in the camp. And that's not current operating procedure in refugee camps, let me say that. Although the commitments and goals are there, That's not what is currently being done. So having a lower cost, at least for one of the elements of cost, a lower cost solution, I think is attractive. There would still be a big funding gap. That's a parallel conversation that we'd have to think about. But I guess the one of the limitations maybe of a refugee camp pilot is limited productive use equipment or productive use opportunities. So you don't necessarily have what you would have in, just in rural or even urban settings, where you could have a whole host of productive use. But nonetheless, that's so I think that I agree with you. I think that the opportunity is there. We would need to supplement the sort of energy footprints that already exist in these settings with the explicit goal of providing universal access, 100% electrification in the camp.
Yeah, I think from a end user or customer perspective, I think there's probably three different categories, and I think there's situations where you're basically you need to. There's already a lot of energy being used. It's just expensive through diesel or whatever it might be, and that's one group of folks, and that would include like the UN ops sort of in that category. I think there's a second category that's places where there's a lot of really nascent potential for productive use of electricity, and that's sort of like the second most easy case in terms of users of electricity and energy. And then I think there's a third group that is really, really sort of rural, very poor areas where there's not a whole lot of things going on. And I think those require different solutions, but I think one of the common trends across all that, and I think something to consider as this is being built out as a thought, is it's one thing to do a system level analysis and say like, yeah, absolutely, you should absolutely do solar and batteries because it's way cheaper than diesel on a dollars per kilowatt hour basis, and like I still say that, and it is true, but there's some really big challenges in actually moving from a system level like wonky techno-economic analysis to how are decisions and budgets actually made across institutions, including the UN, where I think one of the big challenges for like UN peacekeeping, I would assume, is there's an OPEX line item in their budget where the diesel fuel falls, and there's a CAPEX budget for like a solar battery. And even though like on a system level, it's way cheaper for the UN to like build solar batteries rather than operate diesel generators, it's really difficult for them to do that from how they're structured as a budget, and that's sort of where I think things like finance and helping you use more renewables and offering the finance that needs to come in, so you can say, yeah, it's a no-brainer to do this instead of backup diesel or whatever it is, makes that easier, and it's not unique to this initiative, but I think that's something to be thinking about.
Ron, any thoughts?
I really agree with the three use cases and the need for kind of tailored solutions. I guess I wanted to note and really appreciate your comment that I think it is vital that we have some early mover projects that we kind of learn together. And so I'll just, for the National Renewable Energy Lab, I'll just speak in terms of we'd be happy to explore collaborating on, some quick analysis of what would be, I think in your case, it's primarily a cost question. What would be the cost advantage? We have a program called the Clean Energy Solution Center where we can do some quick work with countries, especially if there's a government that we can speak to that might consume or be interested in the product. But anyways, something we can take offline. But I think identifying some early mover cases that we all work together on would be of great value, and being informed by some analysis to understand what the benefits and feasibility would be important.
Yeah, and we'll also take your contact details in the Rockefeller Foundation, and we know familiar with the context in Armenia and a lot of challenges there, and very keen to be supportive in whatever way we can. Yes, please.
Good morning. My name is Jabesh Misarthar. I'm an energy consultant from Ghana. And I have a couple of questions, but I also have a couple of things that I'd like to say. I think that some of the ways in which universal access gets put out as a end all be all, as an end goal, I think to some degree paints kind of the wrong picture about the people who are intended to be beneficiaries from universal electricity access. And let me say it like this, especially when we talk about mini grids as being kind of the forefront of how we provide electricity access, we fundamentally forget how mini grids actually operate the way the world functions today. The reason mini grids do not get that much play is if I decided I wanted 100% renewable energy for my specific use case for my home, at the time when I need it, renewable energy for the most part is not productive where I live. And so the result is I end up having to pair it with some version of fossil fuels. So the thing is, the question becomes, are we looking at an ideologically based, we've decided that renewable energy is the way we go, or are we looking at the beneficiaries and saying, what do you need in order to live the quality of life that you need? Because if we're doing it the opposite kind of way, we're going to get the sort of results that we've been getting the last decade or two, which is inertia, because no one is willing to actually say, from the beneficiary side of the equation, that that sort of assistance is not exactly what they need. So I'll start with that statement. But now the second part comes with discussing what broadly has become accepted as being the competitiveness of renewable energy versus conventional energy. In my part of the world, even if you talk to people who run organizations that supply renewable energy, you sell solar panels? Do you use solar in your house? No, they don't. And the reason for it is largely because the capex is still unbearable. So even if you're able to bring over more financially competitive solar panels, the fundamental still remains that the solar panel is still the cheapest component of that entire setup. You have an inverter that's still incredibly expensive. At the cost of an inverter, or maybe less than half the cost of an inverter, just for an offsetting level of solar energy, you could purchase a generator and shift all the other costs to OPEX, which is way more manageable for the average human being than the CAPEX required to provide the same use case, right? So I think that as much as there is a potential solution and there is a consideration, I think there's some generics about the operational efficiency and the cost benefit analysis that fundamentally has to consider what cash flow means to people rather than just some long-term LCOE or other. That's a whole different argument that we're going to need to have about LCOE as a metric for trying to determine competitiveness of comparable technologies. Now, the last question that I have really is about market. If I'm a power developer, a power project developer, and I have an asset that has been fully amortized, so it's at the end of its economic life, but it's not at the end of its financial life. Why would I give that away? So if I fully amortize the solar panel and it's 85% productive, meaning I no longer have any debts to repay on it, but I can still sell electricity basically somewhere close to the original electricity price, why would I take out the solar panel, go give that away, and buy a brand new solar panel that's more expensive to put back in there so I can take more debt onto my books? Because the financial life of that asset is not over yet, right? So there's some conversation that has to get had, and for me, that's where the conversation about dumping comes in. Because someone somewhere sees a financial benefit in moving these things on. And we see the example quite clearly in countries that are adopting EVs at extreme speed, is that all of a sudden, all these internal combustion vehicles become available, and countries like mine suddenly have to import all these internal combustion vehicles, and I have to breathe them in, right? Simply because someone else elsewhere has put forth the logic, and this secondary market for dirtier, less climate-friendly, more polluting things are arriving in shores like mine in Ghana, and unfortunately, I don't want them there. And I would prefer for everybody to buy a new car. Not everybody deserves a car, I'm sorry, right? Because then it creates a whole heap of other problems. Like in Ghana, for example, we're dealing with an epidemic of just about everybody now having a car, to the point where we're now getting one person per vehicle, and the traffic is becoming unbearable. The productivity is going all the way down, and it's becoming absolutely impossible to have a good quality of life. Over the last decade, our quality of air indices have completely gone out of it, right? And so I do think that sometimes there are unintended consequences for taking things that fundamentally have reached the end of their economic life and maybe not intentionally saying we're going to dump them, but when the technology moves, there is a financial incentive for other things to happen and move it further down the chain and give those problems to other people. And so I think we need to have an honest conversation about what that means, because the truth of the matter is when these panels arrive on the shores of, I think we can say that Africa probably has the largest population of folks without electricity access fundamentally. And so a lot of what is being talked about is somehow eventually, for the most part, going to end up on the African continent. And it is going to come across as dumping, largely because it's going to be foreign capital benefiting a foreign business to make a foreign case for foreign debt to take more money out of the African continent just to say that there was assistance provided.
I can maybe just on the first part of what you were saying, you're absolutely right. I think for the end user of the electricity or energy, it has to be cheaper than what they're doing now, or better for other reasons. And when I think about what really transformed the residential PV industry in the United States, it's when you were able to package solar panels as a long-term PPA, if you will, with that customer that was cheaper than the power that they were paying to the utility, and that benefited from a bunch of hard cost reductions, but that also required financial structures and contractual things that made it cheaper, or at least at the same price to get a solar PV array on your house as it did to pay the utility. And I think that's the same sort of stuff that we need to do in mini grids or whatever the power system is. I think on the middle part of your comments, I think for batteries in particular, it's a different use case. So you're taking something out of a vehicle that needs a set of characteristics that's different than you need for stationary power. And so I think there's the value there is you still have a lot of capacity in that battery, but not enough to do what you need to do in a vehicle. I think the PV, the solar side, it's a great question, and I suspect you can make more money by putting new panels in and getting the extra power out of that. And in Germany,
You can.
so that's, I'm guessing, what's going on there. But it's the same thing where it's like,
And you can access the PPA, the existing PPA, with a new panel. So there's an economic value to swapping out the panel, but the panel still has a value. So that's what we're seeing. We're seeing, as an asset that has reached the end of its economic value in one context, but could potentially have an economic value in another context. So that's the kind of use case. But if that isn't substantiated, we're still here at the very start of our journey. If that isn't substantiated, well, then we have a no-go kind of situation. But those are the kind of use cases we're looking at on the supply side. But anyway, sorry, Gary.
no, that's it. But I think I think fundamentally, to me, it has to come down to economics, not in a LCOE calculation, but what is the actual cash outflow for the consumer or customer. And I think that's certainly possible, but that's just where it's important to bring in the financial side of this, in addition to just the lowering the capex.
Anyone else on the panel before we wrap up?
I just wanted to, one of the last points you talked about, which is really critical, Eric brought this up again, is we really need to be very intentional at the front about how we deal with this end-of-life issue, and making sure that if we're embarking on such an effort here, we're very intentionally thinking about how can we support the final recycling and reuse and disposition so this doesn't become a dumping issue. But we really need to make that a central element of such an initiative.
I heard the example made about, was it 4 gigawatts that Germany is going to?
7 gigawatts ready to come off.
7 gigawatts ready to come off. If I may make a suggestion, if Germany is going to keep putting in more coal plants, maybe they should hold on to those panels.
I don't think Germany's building any.
Well, no, they've been putting coal plants back in service since Russia been turning off the gas.
I mean, probably not time to have this argument. But I mean, I think you make a good point. I think we should have had a more diverse panel for a start, because I think having, four folks from the global north up here to talk about this is not the best solution. And I think you've made a lot of extremely valuable points that we need to consider. But Ron, were you finished in what you were about to say? But anyway, look, I think we're at the very start of a journey here. I think you've made some extremely important points. I think there's a lot of issues to be considered and addressed here. So on the one hand, we have the supply side. Is there going to be a supply? How do we aggregate that supply of those assets? And then we need to evaluate, is there going to be a demand? And that's the work that the Rockefeller Foundation wants to do over the next 12-month period. We have a hypothesis, an idea. We need to validate that. We need to talk to a lot of people. And if there is a supply of a valuable asset and there's a demand for that valuable asset, then the question becomes, how do you make that market? How do you match that supply with that demand? And there's a lot that needs to be validated at all points in that potential supply chain. And so that's the work that we plan to do in the year ahead. We've had a really good first discussion here, and please do continue to engage with us. Anybody who wants our contact details, we're happy to have that exchange after the session. But thank you so much to our panelists, to our audience. We really appreciate it, and we'll wrap it up there. Thank you.